All right, everybody. It is about 7:30, so we're going to get started. Welcome. My name is Jeff Hunt. I have the wonderful privilege of serving as the director of the Centennial Institute at Colorado Christian University. We also host our annual Western Conservative Summit each year, which happens in about June. And hope you'll join us June 18th and 19th this year for the Western Conservative Summit. We are very pleased to have one of the people that I admire most when it comes to thinking about ethics in our communities and public policy, Dr. Ryan Anderson, with us to discuss the ethics of COVID-19 vaccines. But before we do that, we always like to start with a word of prayer. And today we have Margot Raddick, a recent Colorado Christian University graduate who's now working full-time in public policy down at the Colorado State Capitol. She's going to lead us in prayer. So I'm going to turn it over to Margot to pray for us this evening.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's pray. Father God, thank you for today. Lord, thank you for those who are watching and those who are viewing this video. Thanks that we get to learn about the ethics of the vaccine. Lord, thank you for Dr. Anderson, who will be teaching us and imparting his wisdom to us. And so I pray that we are able to understand and grasp a lot of what he is saying to us. Lord, I pray for peace in our nation. God, I pray that you would give wisdom and grace and truth to our leaders in government, to our president, to those serving both on local, state, as well as federal. Lord, you are the peacekeeper and the waymaker. And so we pray for healing in our nation. Lord, we pray for peace. And we thank you for the work that is being done in and through Centennial Institute. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Margot. And thank you for being involved in public policy and trying to make a difference. We really appreciate that. Casey Rance, a student here at Colorado Christian University, is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So Casey, go ahead and lead us in the pledge.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Casey. Thank you for representing our students so well here. Well, friends, if we were in a normal year, we'd be gathering with Dr. Ryan Anderson here at the campus of Colorado Christian University to explore these issues. We'd have students, we'd have the general public all together to ask questions and to discuss. Some people are asking, why would we do this live? Well, because we want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, go ahead and type in questions in the chat feature, and I'll be relaying those to Dr. Anderson later this evening. Tonight's question has to do with the ethics of COVID vaccinations. The COVID vaccine has raised a number of ethical questions. And tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Ryan Anderson, founder and editor-in-chief of Public Discourse. COVID-19 vaccine, was it developed from cell lines derived from aborted fetuses? If so, should a citizen of conscience who is opposed to abortion avail herself of it to protect herself and her loved ones during this time of pandemic? What are other ethical implications around vaccines? Should governments make vaccinations mandatory? Could businesses refuse service without a vaccine passport? Colorado has mandated that a 22-year-old healthy, quote, frontline journalist receive the vaccines before a 64-year-old with chronic lung problems. Is this vaccine distribution plan ethical? What is the government's ethical role in creating, researching, informing, distributing, and mandating vaccinations? Dr. Ryan Anderson, as I mentioned, is the founder and editor-in-chief of Public Discourse. That's where I came across one of his articles about this very issue and why I decided to invite him to speak to us this evening. He's also the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He's written a number of books, and he's spoken on these books here at Colorado Christian University. He's the author of When Harry Met Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom, which I had some of my students here at CCU read. He is the co-author of What is Marriage, Man and Women, a defense and debating religious liberty and discrimination, as the co-editor of A Liberalism Safe for Catholicism, Perspectives from the Review of Politics. So you can see it's very well written and has appeared on a number of different television shows. I won't go through all of them, but ABC, CNN, CNBC, Fox News, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. His writings and research have been cited by 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices, Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas. I want to get into a little of my personal history with Dr. Ryan Anderson, because I've been so impressed with his career. I was first kind of started to follow him online probably in about 2006. I think you were working with Dr. Robbie George on some projects at that point, and saw how brilliantly you defended traditional family values, the definition of marriage, the traditional definition of marriage. And I was just so impressed. I've been following you. You've definitely faced a lot of critics, and you've done it with grace and with intelligence. And I'm just so honored to have Dr. Ryan Anderson to lead us this evening. So we'll hear from Dr. Ryan Anderson, and then we'll ask questions afterwards, but I'll turn it over to you, my friend.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with everyone tonight, at least via Zoom. I'm hoping that next year we'll all be together in Colorado. All of my previous visits to Colorado Christian University have been a great joy, a great blessing. And so I hope it's not before too long that we can gather again. So let me say a couple preliminaries. When Jeff asked me to talk about the COVID-19 vaccine ethics, at first I was just thinking, oh, it'll just be about the abortion issue. And then as I look more and more into this, it was, no, there are a lot of questions we're going to be talking about. So to give you an idea of what the outline of tonight's lecture, we're going to talk about the ethics in developing a vaccine, the ethics in receiving a vaccine, the ethics in distributing a vaccine, the ethics of a government mandating a vaccine, and the ethics of businesses requiring a vaccine. So we're going to go with those 5 parts: developing, receiving, distributing, mandating, and requiring. But before we do that, I want to say a little bit by way of some preliminaries. And one of the first things to say is that while tonight's lecture is going to focus on vaccination, none of us should think that any one mitigation strategy alone is the right solution. Meaning, chances are you're going to want to have a combination of vaccine and mask and certain lockdowns or stay at home or don't work in the office if you can work from home, and rapid testing to see if you have COVID, and contact tracing, and just the knowledge and the information about how the disease spreads and how you can prevent it, et cetera, et cetera. So one thing to highlight is that even though we'll be mainly talking about the vaccine today, that shouldn't make us think that like a vaccine only approach is the best way to go, or a mask only, or a lockdown only, or something like that. Which then means that to get the right balance, you're not just going to need a moral philosopher, right? So when Jeff introduced me, I think it's important that he said, Dr. Anderson. It's important to remind people that I'm a PhD. So come to me with your metaphysical problems, not with your physical problems. I don't have an MD. And that's important for us to recognize. We're going to need people with lots of different expertise. And we're going to need people with scientific expertise, with medical expertise, with expertise in epidemiology. But you can't outsource your moral thinking and your policy thinking to doctors and scientists, right? While doctors and scientists might have technical expertise in their fields, that doesn't necessarily mean that they possess wisdom or prudence or any great insight into morality and policy. And in fact, sometimes people can suffer from a form of limited vision, myopia, right? Where they're so focused on their particular issue that they don't see the bigger picture. So for example, you could be focusing so much on physical health that you aren't seeing what the consequences are for mental health or spiritual health or economic health, right? That we want to be holistic in our response, meaning we care both about lives and livelihoods and the things that make life worth living, right? Sometimes a cure can be worse than a disease. Simply to say that we want to be holistic in thinking of all of the options, and we want to be holistic in thinking about all of the things that matter. And this is just another way of saying that what we're concerned about is the common good, right? Not just one aspect of the common good, physical health or the reduction of of risk to physical health, but we want to be talking about physical health and mental health and spiritual health and economic well-being and civil liberties, right? These are all aspects of the common good, but no one of them is the exclusive aspect of the common good, which also means that certain liberties and rights will have limits. Just like there will be limits to what we should do to protect public health, what we should do, limits to how we protect public safety, limits to how we protect economic growth, there will also be limits to some of our civil liberties. Last thing I'll say is how to think about the common good, because it's not a collectivist picture, right? This isn't like a, sometimes people hear common good and they think communism or socialism. No, like the easiest way to think about common good is think about the common good of your family, right? Most people listening to this are a son, a daughter, a brother, a sister, a husband, a wife, a mother, a father. We flourish as individuals, but we also flourish as members of societies. And so part of what you would be doing if you're the head of a household is thinking not just how do I flourish as an individual, but how does my family flourish? And if I have responsibility for the flourishing of my family, what does that require of me, right? And you could think of, the flourishing of your family, the flourishing of your business, the flourishing of your neighborhood, of your city, of your state, of your church. And so it's almost like a nested set of common goods, right? I locate my good within the common good of my family, within the common good of my business, of my neighborhood, city, state, keeps getting concentric circles larger and larger. What this also means that we're talking about human flourishing, right? Not just desire satisfaction, not just utility maximization, right? This isn't utilitarian. It's not consequentialist. Given our nature, as created bodily beings, what actually makes for authentic happiness and what does not. And it also points out that we're by nature social creatures. We come into life as part of families. Most of us will go through life as members of families. We'll then form our own families. We'll be part of lots of different societies. Many of you are members of the Colorado Christian University community. You're members of a political community known as the state of Colorado. You're part of a political community known as the United States of America. And so we're going to see that each one of these communities has a common good, and we should think about how we pursue that. And then last thing as a preliminary remark is that we should have special concern for the most vulnerable members of our communities. Right? We should have special concern for the least amongst us. And this is going to mean that we prioritize their well-being as part of our own well-being. Right? That I want to act not just for my own sake, but for the sake of my neighbor, and prioritizing my neighbors who are most at risk. Okay, so 5 parts: developing, receiving, distributing, mandating, and requiring. Let's move on to this first part, developing a vaccine. So let's say you're a scientist, you're a doctor, and you're thinking through what is the morality of me as I go about seeking a vaccine. And one of the very first things to say here is that morality has to govern science, not vice versa. Science and medicine are techniques. Techniques are tools that we deploy in pursuit of human goods. And so in this case, science and medicine are tools that we use in pursuit of health and human well-being. And so why are we developing vaccines in the first place? To try to both end the pandemic and to end some of the responses to the pandemic that are harming lives and livelihoods, right? The pandemic has been costly, so too have various forms of shutdowns and requirements to work from home and things like that. And a vaccine has the potential to bring some of this finally to an end. So why are scientists and doctors working to develop a vaccine? Precisely to promote human dignity, to promote human flourishing, to promote health. So there's a moral vision undergirding what science is doing, what medicine's doing. And therefore that same moral vision places limits on how scientists and doctors pursue that human good, right? You can't do evil for the sake of good, right? The ends don't justify the means. So this is not unique to vaccine ethics. Just think throughout human history of ways in which we've had unethical scientific or medical experimentation. Think of some of the Nazi medical experiments. Think about the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. And if you're not familiar with those, this is something that took place throughout the 20th century here in the United States, where African Americans were told that they were going to be receiving free healthcare, free medical treatments, but they were never told that they had syphilis, and they were never treated for syphilis, even though penicillin had been developed, it was in existence, and it was known to be the proper treatment for penicillin, for syphilis, penicillin was. So in essence, we treated a certain number of human beings as if they were human guinea pigs. You can't do evil, even for a good end. In a different context, you can think about some of the experiments that are being conducted right now on children with gender dysphoria. Think about puberty blocking drugs, think about cross-sex hormones, think about sex reassignment surgeries, all of which are being performed on minors right now. Scientists, medical doctors are pursuing a moral vision, and therefore they're limited by morality. Morality needs to govern science. And so in the vaccine context, one of the bright lines here is going to be you can't kill human beings in order to save human beings. You can't engage in, for example, embryo destructive research for the sake of developing a cure, or abortion for the sake of a cure. So killing a life to save a life doesn't pass a moral test. Okay, so then the question becomes, all right, but can you benefit from someone else's act of abortion or embryo destruction? Let's say, look, you're the doctor or the scientist, you're not doing the lethal action, but someone else is. And this is where, within kind of the jargon of moral philosophy and moral theology, you hear the concepts of cooperation with evil. And cooperation with evil is distinguished between formal cooperation with evil and material cooperation with evil. And with formal cooperation of evil, you cooperate and you share the intention or the objective of the evil act. And so an example of this would be you donate money to Planned Parenthood precisely so that they can perform abortions, right? Here you are formally cooperating with evil. The nature of your action is done with the same intention, with the same objective, that unjust killings take place. Something similar would be true if you said to a laboratory, let's take the stem cell context, we want you to destroy some human embryos and then give us the inner cell mass so we can then develop a stem cell line, right? So no formal cooperation. And the reason why is that from a moral perspective, it doesn't matter whether you perform the lethal action with your own hand or whether you share in the evil action through your will, right? Because ultimately morality is going to be a matter of the heart. Think of all the times we hear Christ talk about the pure of heart, right? So whether I kill someone, or I hire Jeff to kill someone, or I ask Jeff, hey, once you've killed someone, give me the organs, right? That's a form of formal cooperation. It's unacceptable. Now, sometimes you can engage in what's known as material cooperation if there are justifying reasons. Now, it's hard actually to think of what a form of material cooperation would look like in this area. So I'll give you some other examples. You materially cooperate with evil every time you buy coffee from Starbucks, because Starbucks takes a certain percentage of the money you spend there, some of that material, and then they donate it to Planned Parenthood. Material cooperation within like kind of the academic jargon, it's distinguished between immediate and mediate based upon how close that assistance redounds to the evil action, and then between proximate and remote, between again how close and how removed. Is it far away, so it's remote cooperation? Is it proximate? Is it up close? For now, we can leave that to the side, because I think what's actually happening in the COVID-19 vaccine is something known as appropriation of evil. This is where you're not cooperating in an ongoing form of evil, buying a coffee from Starbucks where some of your money goes to Planned Parenthood, which can be justified, right? If you're in an airport, you need some caffeine, it's the only coffee shop, that's fine. Now, it would be different if you go there precisely because they donate money to Planned Parenthood. Right? Now you're entering into a form of formal cooperation where you're sharing the evil intention. But I think these vaccine cases raise the question of appropriation for people. This is where you are benefiting from someone else's past act of wrongdoing. And now this can be morally acceptable if you do so without in any way condoning the past evil. So you make it clear that you do not support the past evil action that was done, and you make it clear that you're not in any way incentivizing future evils. So one example of this, let's say I don't ask Jeff to kill someone, but someone's assassinated. And they have an organ donor. They are an organ donor, so their license says that they're an organ donor. I'm a victim of an assassination. I'm a victim of a homicide. I go to the hospital and they say, oh, we can't save his life, but we can transplant some of his organs. That's an appropriation from evil, right? My unjust killing was evil. And yet we are okay with benefiting from it because no one thinks that transplant organs is in any way condoning or glamorizing hitmen, nor is it incentivizing future hitmen, right? And so there's a distinction there. Now that could be different if all of a sudden people are like, well, if I start killing people, we'll have more transplant parts, we'll have more transplant organs. Then you might say, wait a minute, having transplant organs is actually glamorizing and incentivizing future homicides. It's creating a market or an incentive of this, and so we shouldn't benefit from past acts of wrongdoing. So in our situation, at least when it comes to adults who come in for organ donation, we don't have that problem. That now raises the question: all right, what about with the abortion industry? Do you give prestige or glamour to the abortion industry if you benefit in some way from a past abortion? Do you create more demand for abortion if you benefit from a past abortion? And here it's really important to create a distinction between fetal cell lines and fetal tissue. Fetal cell lines, the most prominent one that we'll be talking about tonight is HEK 293. It stands for human embryonic kidney. 293 was the 293rd attempt before they actually successfully developed the line. And what it is a more or less, functionally speaking, immortal cell line. So it was derived about 50 years ago from a child who died. We're uncertain actually if this child was killed in an abortion, or was it a miscarriage, or was it a medically necessary abortion. We don't know the exact history of this because the doctor, the scientist who, at some point he was given the kidney and then he created the cell line, he doesn't know the origins of the kidney, which just shows that separation between possibly at some point there was an evil action performed on this child 50 years ago, and can we today benefit from it? And that's different than fetal tissue, which would, for example, require ongoing abortions. So, a cell line is something that's self-replicating. It's almost immortal in that sense. Something that actually used fetal tissue would constantly need a new supply of unborn children who were killed to then use their tissue. Now, this has played out, this distinction I'm drawing, twice in recent history from pro-life presidential administrations. One was the George W. Bush administration in 2001. In August of 2001, President Bush made the decision that no federal funds after that date could be used in any research where human embryos were being killed, being destroyed. But he said that for any stem cell lines or any embryos that had been destroyed prior to that date and time, federal funding could be used to benefit what could be benefited from them. So there's a distinction saying the federal government will no longer pay for or incentivize or support fatal research that would be killing human embryos. But if the fatal decision had been made in the past, Bush was going to allow doctors and scientists to appropriate from it. earlier, I guess now, I was going to say earlier this year, it was 2 years ago now, June of 2019, the Trump administration, Department of Health and Human Services, said no more federal funding for any research that involves fetal tissue from abortion. So they wanted to say no funding for anything that would involve the ongoing killing of children. Now, this actually, for some people, creates kind of a somewhat paradoxical conclusion, because what it says is that the abortion shouldn't have taken place to begin with. None of these human embryos or human fetuses should have ever been killed. And yet, if one was unjustly killed, one could licitly, morally benefit from that. Again, if certain conditions are made. All right, so let's apply this to the vaccines currently available in the United States, the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. Neither of those vaccines use any fetal tissue. So there is no kind of fetal tissue being used in the development or the testing, the production stage of these vaccines. And neither of them was produced using fetal cell lines. Neither of them were produced using fetal cell lines. Neither of them are currently being manufactured with fetal cell lines. But both of them did use that fetal cell line HEK 293 that was created 50 some years ago from what looks like it was most likely an abortion, although we're not entirely certain. Both of them used that in the testing or the verification stage. Essentially, the way that doctors describe this is it's like a quality control stage where they test to make sure that it's safe and that it's efficacious and that there's certain standards being met. And this is true of more or less every major pharmacological development in the past several decades, right? So it's not unique to the COVID vaccine that doctors are using and have been using HEK 293, that cell line, in a whole variety of products, medical products, pharmacological products. And the general sense has been that it is morally licit to do so. So if you're the researcher and you're wondering, can I use HEK 293 to test a product that we're developing? If you don't have any other alternative, it's morally licit to do so. All right, next set of questions. How about you receiving the vaccine? So let's say you're a patient and you want to know, can I receive a vaccine? Should I vaccinate or not? How do you think about this? Here again, I think you want to act not just for your personal health and your personal well-being, but again, for the health and the well-being of your neighbors. Right? You immunize to protect your own health, but you also immunize to protect people who can't be immunized. You know, maybe they have allergies to the particular vaccine in question. Maybe they have immune issues where they can't be vaccinated. Maybe they're one of the 5% who is vaccinated, but the vaccine doesn't seem to be effective. Both Moderna and Pfizer are reporting 95 and 96% efficacious rates for these vaccines. So one of the things, this is a form of neighbor love. One of the ways in which you help love your neighbors is by vaccinating so that they don't get sick. And this is particularly important with something like a pandemic where, how long until we reach herd immunity means how many lives die in the meantime. Right? So when herd immunity is on the line, time equals lives. This is all just another way of saying that we have duties to help protect others. And at the end of all of our practical rationality should be, what's the common good? The common good of my family, the common good of my business, common good of my city, state, nation, common good of my immediate church, common good of my larger, ecclesial communion, all of that stuff. That's what we should be thinking about. All right, but this doesn't mean you should just receive any old pharmacological product into your body. First, you need some empirical information, because every vaccine, every medication, every a medical product you might receive has certain risks, certain side effects. And so in the colloquial sense, you would say, is it worth it? You need to know, given the likely benefits, the likely harms, is it worth it? In the technical moral language, you want to say, is it proportionate? So you have to do an analysis, the proportionality of possible side effects. So what does this look like? You have to ask yourself, what are the harms that the vaccine's trying to prevent? what is the efficacy of the vaccine? How effective is it at precisely preventing those harms? What's the safety of the vaccine? What are the risks of the vaccine? What are the unknowns of the vaccine? And the proportionality of those things are going to stand in a certain relationship. And what I mean by this is that the graver the harms that are going to be potentially prevented, the more risk you're likely to take. Meaning, if the only harm that you were going to prevent would be something like a runny nose, then you probably wouldn't take a vaccine that had certain risks. But you might take that same vaccine with those same risks if the harms were death, right? Difference between runny nose and death means that you're going to be willing to take graver risks. Same thing with the safer the vaccine is, the more willing you're going to be to take it, right? So a vaccine that has a 50% fatality rate, you might not want to take unless the alternative is a 99% fatality rate. So again, these things, the proportionality stands in a relationship. The graver the harm, the more risk, the safer the vaccine, the more willingness. And then same thing with how efficacious it is. If the vaccine's not particularly efficacious, if it's not particularly safe, if the risk isn't particularly grave, you wouldn't be likely to receive it. Now, it is important to note that from the 2 COVID vaccines that are available in America, you can't get COVID from them. These are mRNA vaccines. What they contain is a protein that then triggers your body to produce a response that will prevent you from getting COVID. But this is different than some other vaccines where they give you a kind of like a low, weaker version of the virus. So then your body creates the immune response. Some historic flu vaccines have been that way. They give you kind of an inert, a weakened form of the virus so that your body then produces antibodies. And the COVID vaccines are different. It's a new form of technology here. Okay, so those are all the safety and kind of efficacy concerns that you would have to think through. So far, there aren't any reports of there being particularly profound safety concerns or risk concerns. There's a pretty high rate of efficacy in terms of the 95, 96%, and the harms are pretty severe. The harms of COVID that we are trying to prevent have been severe enough that many of us have been operating under various forms of like lockdown and stay at home and mask orders and no gatherings more than this number. I mean, we've taken pretty serious measures to combat this. But again, that's an empirical question, and you're going to have to look at the empirical literature and then analyze it morally. All right, so now there's another question though. Once you think through those things, you're just like, all right, but is it licit from the pro-life perspective? Because there's one thing to say the vaccine is proportionate. The risks, the safety, the efficacy, the harms that we're trying to combat, those all make sense, but what if the vaccine was developed through immoral methods? And this is now right back to where we were with the appropriation of evil. I don't think there's going to be any formal cooperation of evil here if you're a pro-life citizen. Like none of you would be receiving the vaccine with the precise intention to, incentivize abortion or something like that. Your will wouldn't be sharing the will of the evil objective, the evil outcome. It's also not clear how there would be a form of material cooperation in these vaccines because none of them were made from ongoing abortions. None of them are incentivizing future abortions. And so it seems like we're back to the discussion about appropriation from evil. And so just as the medical doctor or the scientist could appropriate from a past evil, so too could you. Again, none of the approved US vaccines used fetal tissue. None of them is produced using fetal cell lines. Both of them used the fetal cell line HEK 293 in the testing verification stage. So this isn't creating any new demand for abortion, and it's not glamorized. No one, to my mind, no one reasonably would be saying, this just shows what a great institution Planned Parenthood is because they've provided us 50 years ago with tissue to make a vaccine. And this isn't unique or new to COVID-19. The rubella vaccine, the chickenpox vaccine, and the hepatitis A vaccine, they were all three of the ones that are available in the United States, FDA approved in the US, they were all produced in one way or another with the assistance of fetal cell lines from abortions that took place either in the 60s or in the 70s. And to give you an idea of kind of how previous bioethicists have weighed in on this, in 2005, the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Life, so like the highest within the Catholic Church, the highest kind of group that focuses on the pro-life issue, said it's morally acceptable to receive all of these vaccines when there's not an alternative, right? If there are vaccines that had no connection to abortion, those would be preferable. If you can develop a vaccine with no connection to abortion, that would be preferable. But if you can't, it is okay to benefit from a past evil because you're not in any way promoting future evils if you do it in the right way, and you can prevent grave evils. So think about something like Bella. It's a pretty bad disease, and so this is a way of preventing people that have loss of life, loss of livelihood. So all that is simply to say that it strikes me that you would be on pretty good moral footing if, you know, after you look into the empirical evidence about the efficacy and the safety, and you do the moral analysis, that this wouldn't necessarily violate a pro-life conscience. All right, so now we have questions about distributing a vaccine. Right? We've talked about developing a vaccine. We've talked about receiving a vaccine. How should we think about distributing a vaccine? If you're the government official or you're just a healthcare official at a hospital, and you have to come up with a plan of how do we prioritize who's going to receive the vaccine, what should you be thinking about? Right? Because what I'm trying to do here is giving you a framework, not just for thinking about COVID vaccines, but really to think about vaccinations in the future, really thinking about some of these public health and bioethics questions, not just today, but, you know, as students, I hope this stays with you for future bioethical questions. And so here, the prioritization should be based upon justice and the common good. It shouldn't be based upon aspects of quality of life, where some lives are more valuable than others based upon the quality of life. We should be, human equality is a central aspect of justice and the common good. We should view every life as having intrinsic worth and dignity, and as having equal intrinsic worth and dignity. And so, whereas we saw earlier in the pandemic, there were some states that were prioritizing younger people ahead of older people because they were judging that the lives of elderly people weren't as worth living, or people with disabilities weren't as worth healing. Those are grave forms of injustice. So what we should be thinking about is who's most at risk. So that's one aspect of the common good, is, you know, reaching out to the vulnerable, protecting those most at risk. But we also think about who's most essential to the healthcare profession, especially if the threat to the common good is a healthcare threat. You need to protect frontline workers. You need to prevent healthcare workers. You also need to think about who receiving a vaccination will be most critical to preventing the spread of the disease. So you want to think about who's most at risk, who's most essential to healthcare, who receiving the vaccine would be most effective at preventing further spread of the disease. And then also who's most essential to the common good in some other aspect. And I'll give you some examples of that. Now, there won't be any one size fits all answer to these questions. You're going to have certain empirical knowledge, certain technical expertise, right? So it's not just something a moral philosopher can give you the answer to. You actually need to know about this particular disease, this particular virus, this particular pandemic, who's most at risk from it, who's most essential to combating it, who's most critical to the spread of it, and then who else might be at risk. So let me give you a couple kind of ways to think of this. Obviously, you couldn't afford to have all of your doctors get sick from a illness and pass away. Right? If you had a virus that was like particularly deadly for like 30, 40, 50, and 60-year-olds, and, you know, that's the age of most of your physicians, and if they got that particular disease, and then they all were unable to heal people, that would be a problem. So you have to prioritize them if that was the situation, precisely not because they have more dignity or they have more worth or they have a greater moral status. It's because the role that they play in the political community, and therefore the role that they play for the political common good, makes them particularly essential. So too, imagine if that same disease was, particularly targeted at 30, 40, 50, and 60-year-olds. You couldn't afford to have all of your parents get sick and die and leave behind a generation of orphans, right? So for a certain illness, you could see prioritizing parents of small kids, because if a whole bunch of middle-aged parents got sick, and then you had a whole bunch of infants and toddlers that were now orphaned, the political community wouldn't flourish. You couldn't have all of your police officers and prison guards get sick. So that's the question there of who has a unique role, and given the way that the threat is facing us, who needs to be prioritized. Now, there's also an interesting technical question of, if the goal is we're focusing at who's most at risk of getting sick and who plays a unique role in the common good, it may not necessarily be that immunizing those people is actually the best way of protecting those people. Right? So it may be that, if your goal is protecting those people, it's actually a different segment of the population that should be prioritized for immunization, because those are the ones most likely to be spreading it to the population that's most vulnerable. I mentioned I'm a PhD in political philosophy, moral philosophies, where I've been focusing a lot of my reading and writing most recently. So I don't want to give you kind of an answer as if I'm an epidemiologist or as if I'm a medical doctor. This is going to require empirical knowledge, technical expertise, and it needs to be done, again, considering all of the options. So both the vaccine and masking and certain limited openings, rapid testing, so we can know whether or not we have it, contact tracing, knowledge, information campaigns, et cetera, and considering all the factors, right? Not just our physical health, but our mental health, our spiritual health, our lives, our livelihoods, the things that make life worth living. All of that needs to go into the moral calculus in thinking about how you're going to be prioritizing the vaccine. All right, so how about now the fourth part of the lecture? What about mandating a vaccine? Right? What if we, our current problem seems to be that there are too many people who want to be vaccinated and there aren't enough vaccines going around, and that some states are, doing some kind of like silly social justice stuff where they're prioritizing not based on, greatest risk or greatest need or greatest role or most important function for the common good, but they're prioritizing, based on identity politics. Right? And then we have all these vaccines going to waste. So that seems to be our current problem. But what if we had a different problem where it's not too many people want to be vaccinated and we don't have enough vaccines, but we have a problem of we have too few people wanting to be vaccinated? Could the state mandate a vaccine? And the short answer is yes, in theory. And I'm going to give you the argument why, and then we'll have to decide whether or not, in current circumstances, it would be justified. But in theory, it could be justified. And there's actually a Supreme Court case I'll mention in which they said the state does have the authority. The first thing here to say is that authority isn't a dirty word. Political authority exists for a reason. We're by nature political animals. Aristotle says that, we're a social animal, we're a conjugal animal, meaning we're a familial animal, and we're a political animal. We can't flourish. We can't exist without political community. And bearing political authority is a way of serving us. And this is why we pray for good leaders to be in positions of authority, because we need people in authority to protect human dignity, human flourishing, human rights, all of these aspects of the common good. But whether or not to mandate something is going to go through a similar thought process as we did on whether or not you yourself should receive the vaccine. What are the harms that are going to be prevented? What's the efficacy of this vaccine? What's the efficacy of a mandate versus an incentive versus a knowledge campaign, right? There are lots of steps a political entity, a city, a state, a nation could take short of mandating, right? So we shouldn't even think that mandating is the first thing. There can be information campaigns, there can be incentives. And then also, what are the safety, what's the safety of this? What's the risk that you're asking citizens to take? And once again, obviously, those things are going to stand in a relationship. Political community could ask citizens to undergo graver risks if there's a graver harm to be combated. And so an easy example here is think about the military draft, think about conscription. Sometimes the government will tell citizens that you have to go fight a war, place your life very much at risk for the sake of protecting the political community. The government does this in a variety of ways, right? So I want to point out that it's not just vaccines, but there are certain circumstances where it could be justified for the political community to say that certain citizens have to do something that they might not otherwise want to do, that they might have to bear a certain risk. The Supreme Court case to look at here is from the early 1900s. It's Jacobson v. Massachusetts, and it involved the state of Massachusetts mandating that citizens of a certain age, above a certain age, receive smallpox vaccinations. Smallpox was a pretty bad disease, so it's a pretty high risk. They thought that the vaccine was pretty effective, pretty safe, and they were going to mandate that. This case went to the Supreme Court, and it was a 7-2 decision saying that your liberty rights aren't unlimited. They're not absolute. Liberty rights are real. We do have certain liberties, but they're all going to be limited. So to give you an idea here of something that I've worked on a lot in my professional life has been religious liberty. And here's how the Catholic Church has talked about this. It says, Catholic Church, the Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power in such way that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. And it's that last phrase, within due limits, that really does a lot of work. Because that's going to be true for religious liberty. There are limits to religious liberty. You can't, if you were a sincere Aztec, you can't engage in human sacrifice. Even if it is your sincere religious belief, there are certain limits. If this is true for property rights, there are certain limits. This is true for free speech rights. All of our rights are subject to justice and the common good. But that also means we shouldn't just say anything can override our rights, right? Again, there needs to be proportionality here. And if you can protect public health while simultaneously protecting parental rights or protecting religious liberty, you must, right? So if you can protect public health without violating rights or without limiting rights, because I actually think it wouldn't be a violation of rights if it's necessary, if it's required. It would be a justified limitation of rights, which is why, for example, parental rights and think religious rights for people who don't believe in certain medications. And I'm an adult. I don't believe in some life-saving medical treatment. The government can't force me to do that for my own sake. But maybe if I'm denying it for my children, the state has a role in saying, when your kids hit 18, they can forego life-saving medicine. But as a minor, we have an obligation to protect their right to life. And so if you're foregoing life-saving medical care for your child, there are going to be certain limits to your religious liberty rights, certain limits to your parental rights. Okay, looking at the clock. So I want to keep going because we got 2 more sections because I didn't tell you there's going to be a 6th section, but we'll get there in a second and then we're going to get to Q&A. All right, how about a business requiring a vaccine? I think here you need to think something very similar to how you would think about this as a political authority, is that let's say you're a business owner. Well, you have obligations to your patrons and to your staff members. You want it to be so that, let's say you're running a restaurant, that your waiters and waitresses aren't placed at undue risk. You want your other customers not to be placed at undue risk. We're all tolerating certain risks now because there isn't, or up until a couple months ago, there hadn't been a vaccine that was FDA approved. And while they might be tolerable risks today, would it be fair for you as a business owner to ask your staff or your patrons to tolerate those risks 6 months from now or a year from now? And different business owners might answer that question differently. Right? So as a political matter, political authority could have either a mandate or an information campaign or an incentive or a benefit. I mean, there are lots of things short of, if you don't do this, you're going to be directly punished. That would go for the entire community. A business owner is just going to be acting for their particular responsibility. And typically what we've thought is that private businesses are free within due limits to run their business according to their best judgments about what justice and the common good requires them. So if one restaurant wants to say that there's going to be a requirement to be vaccinated before you can eat here or before you can fly on this airplane, and a different restaurant or airline doesn't want to make that requirement, there would be a role for letting kind of like the market decide these things. If that proves not to be sufficient for achieving the public health outcome, that might then mean that the state's going to have to play a role in somehow either incentivizing or encouraging or offering knowledge or a penalty if people aren't vaccinated. And again, it depends on whether or not the risks, the threats of COVID outweigh the loss of a certain civil liberty or the loss of a certain autonomy. Right? These things are going to be in a proportion with each other, which leads to the sixth thing. I didn't mention this on the initial outline intentionally, is that you have probably noticed how many times I said this is going to need empirical knowledge and technical expertise. And so the sixth part of this analysis, the morality of COVID vaccine, is that we need the truth and we need to have trust in people with technical expertise and empirical knowledge. We need to have trust that the doctors and the scientists are telling us the truth. And this has been, in general, this is why lying and manipulation is so detrimental to justice and the common good. When people in authority abuse their authority by shading the truth, manipulating the truth, outright lying about the truth, it leads to a situation in which we can't trust people. And morality alone can't provide the outcomes here, right? Moral philosophy alone can't provide the outcomes. It needs to be moral philosophy and morality in conjunction with epidemiology and certain empirical knowledge and technical expertise. And this is simply to say as a conclusion that anytime any public health official manipulated the knowledge that they had, it's one thing to say, look, at this point in time, we thought X, and then as we got more data, as we did more studies, our thinking changed, and, being honest and upfront about that. It's another thing to say at point X, I knew this was the truth, but I didn't think the American public could handle it. Right? And the undermining of trust in institutions, trust in authorities, only exacerbates things, makes things all that the worse when we're being asked to make great sacrifices in life, whether it be through some of the shutdown measures or through some of the potential vaccination measures that could come. My sense right now is that what we need is to know the truth. We need knowledge. We need information. We need to encourage people to receive the vaccine. And I think you can morally receive the vaccine. I don't think someone with pro-life convictions that I have, that hopefully you have, should be prevented for those reasons from receiving either of the two vaccines. Okay, Jeff, with that, I am going to turn things back over to you so you can moderate some questions. And if you want to provide the answers, that would really make my night go better, because I'm looking at the clock. It's 9:24 my time. I'm on East Coast time. I'm normally in bed like by 8:30. So any answers you want to provide, go for it.
Well, you've got your own ranch. You got to be up early with the sheep. I saw we've got sheep added to the goats now, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So as I expected, a lot of comments and a lot of concern. And I think your discussion at the end there was really one of the biggest factors, a distrust in institutions.
Yep.
So Colorado, very socially libertarian state. We not only have, basically a reckless marijuana industry that allows, unlimited THC potency. We got psychedelic mushrooms in Denver. You've got doctor-assisted suicide. You've got abortion with no limits whatsoever in the state. And so people generally kind of, I think, out of a Western historical, not Western as we think of kind of European Western, but Western as in Colorado Western.
The Wild West.
The Wild West. Yeah, they don't like really the government telling anybody what to be doing with their bodies. And so I think they're deeply concerned and have a healthy suspicion of the government. And we're facing, strong pushes from the governor to get these vaccinations done. I think you've done a good job of exploring a lot of the social consequences. And you mentioned that the government doesn't have, I just lost my train of thought on that, but we have some vaccinations that we say you need to get in order to go to school. We have other vaccinations like the flu that are very deadly that we don't require. How do you balance the differences between those two?
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting actually to know, what does CCU require of students before they can live in the dormitories? I remember that, when I went to college, there was a whole checklist of you have to have all these different immunizations before you can come to campus. And, I think for a lot of us, that's how, we got our immunizations was, as a grade schooler, it was before you can go to kindergarten or first grade, you have to have certain immunizations. Before you go to college, you have to have additional ones. And so there does seem to be a certain legitimacy to, Colorado Christian University is a private school. So that's kind of like a private business, right? And you could say that the president of your university is acting for the common good of your university when the president says, look, here are some particularly transmittable diseases for people who are living in close proximity with each other. Here are some vaccines that we know are really, really safe because these have been in production and people have been receiving them for years and years and years. We know they're really, really effective. And so it's not an undue imposition to ask students before they come here to receive these forms of vaccination. Now, whether or not the ordinary flu rises to that level, for most college students, the flu isn't that terrible of an experience, right? Flu vaccination normally is strongly encouraged. Right? In places where I've worked in the past, they would actually give out the flu vaccine right in the building. You go to the front desk, they take you up to a room, and you get your injection in the arm. They incentivize it so, on your healthcare plan, there's no cost. I think they could say that, for a particularly bad strain of the flu. So several years ago, it was the H1N1 virus that, they might want to say that it's going to be something, a requirement. And again, I think that's a prudential question, right? This is one of those things where you're going to have to say, what is the proportionality of the harms that we're trying to prevent, and then the efficacy of the solution, the trade-offs of costs and benefits. And I don't think that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. So a reasonable president could come to different decisions, right? And so maybe Colorado Christian University requires certain vaccinations, and then a different university requires different vaccinations. And it's not as if there's going to be a one-size-fits-all solution.
One of the comments that we're getting, or actually quite a few of the comments, have to do with herd immunity and the notion of herd immunity. So if some people looked at this situation and said the best thing to do is we've just got to move through it and get to a place where enough people have had this, we've developed herd immunity, rather than maybe some type of program for vaccinations, do they stand on an ethical ground, considering all that you talked about, the role that they have with their families and their community, thinking about the most vulnerable? Can they make a reasonable argument that the best way through this is with herd immunity?
I mean, so it depends what they mean by herd immunity. If they mean by herd immunity, just allowing people to contract COVID-19 and then develop antibodies to COVID-19, or do they mean receive the vaccine and have enough? I think different experts are saying it's going to be somewhere between 80 to 85, maybe 90% of the population would need to be vaccinated before you achieved herd immunity. If they mean the latter, I think they have a moral footing. If they mean the former, there would need to be a reason why. Like, why would you prefer to allow the pandemic to run its course, knowing that I think today there were 4,500 Americans who died? And, again, time is lives in a pandemic like this. Why would you want that to continue going until we reach herd immunity, when the alternative would be, if you get enough people vaccinated, you're going to be very more quickly reaching herd immunity and with a lower death count. Now, that's a technical question, right? Is it true that by receiving the vaccine, we will achieve herd immunity more quickly and with a lower death count? And if that is, then I don't see why it would be morally superior to go a different route. Right? Why would you choose a route that would take longer to reach herd immunity and would result in larger death tolls? Unless there was something about the vaccine that made it immoral to receive. And at least for these 2 COVID-19 vaccines available in America, I don't think there's anything there that makes it immoral to receive them. And we could think of a situation in which the vaccines are being developed like with aborted body parts. And then you would say, this is the type of thing that you can't receive. But that's not how these vaccines were developed, right? They do have some involvement with an abortion that took place 50 some years ago in the development of HEK 293, and then using that cell line in the testing, the verification stage. But for all the reasons that we listed out earlier tonight, I don't think that renders it immoral for any one of us to receive that vaccine. And so far, this is also, just so you know, this isn't just like what Ryan is saying. This is what more or less all of the major pro-life organizations have said, including the Vatican, for you're Catholic, but for other, for evangelicals, various kind of reputable pro-life groups have said that, ideally we would have developed a vaccine without using HEK 293, but if HEK 293 was necessary to develop it, it's not unethical for the recipient, the patient, to receive the vaccine.
What would you say about vaccines for activities that I'm thinking of sexually transmitted diseases? So activities that consequences as a result of personal decisions, and the government requiring these. I want to go back to, I believe it was the 2008 presidential primary debates. This came up over HPV vaccinations. And Michelle Bachmann, I believe it was that year, was made this an issue during the presidential primary about government mandating or schools mandating vaccinations against, I believe it was HPV, which is primarily the result of sexual activity. Do you see a difference there in mandating vaccinations for activities that result in personal choices?
Yes, and particularly in this case, it's been a while since I read about. I remember when that debate took place 13 years ago, and I haven't recently reread or kind of refreshed my knowledge. But just in general, I would say, especially if it's a sexual activity, the state would be doing something, to my mind, unjust in undermining parental authority if by, let's say, vaccinating high school students, you're actually now giving them kind of a permission slip to engage in immoral, unethical sex. right? And so like if you're a conscientious parent and you're trying to raise your children to live the virtue of chastity, where sex is a great gift that is meant for marriage, having the government say, oh, but high school freshmen, we're going to be vaccinating you for a sexually transmitted disease, on the assumption that it's appropriate and normal and the run of the course that students should be engaging in sexual activity, right? So I mean that's where I would leave it to parental authority on something like that. And it may be the case that parents who disagree with me about the virtue of chastity and who are encouraging their kids to have sexual relationships in high school would want their kids to be vaccinated. But for parents who have sound views about sexual morality, the government shouldn't be undermining their attempts to raise their children to live out Christian virtue, right? Especially as with respect to our sexuality. And that's one of the areas where I would say that in contemporary America, that's one of the areas where there's probably the starkest difference between Orthodox believers and secular society, and so you don't want the state undermining that.
We're getting quite a few comments about your notion of common good, and
okay.
I think this would be good to flesh out just a little bit more, because comes a bit from Catholic social teaching, and we live in a very unique state, as I had mentioned earlier. Maybe this is where I was going with my initial thought, and I was jumping ahead in my mind, but we do have a responsibility to each other, but that must be balanced with an overbearing state and individual liberty. In fact, you've kind of written, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but your dissertation was on the notion of liberty and falling in between libertarianism and liberalism and how we balance that all. We're a very libertarian state. And we've tried to make this argument with marijuana that there's social costs. So what we were able to point out was that for every $1 of tax revenue we take in, we spend $4.50 mitigating the social effects of marijuana use in the state. So it's a revenue loser. But there are social consequences to our decisions. But we're conservatives and we don't want the state telling us what to do. So how do you balance all those in the notion of a common good?
Yeah, I mean, so think about it this way. The state tells you what to do when it says that you can't drive under the influence of alcohol, beyond a certain, level, right? So you can have like 1 or 2 beers at the bar before driving home, but if you had 5 or 6, you better not get behind the wheel. And the reason why is that 1, you're placing your own life at risk, but 2, you're also placing innocent bystanders at risk. You're placing other innocent motorists at risk. And so, think about it this way: the common good of safe, efficient vehicular transportation. What's required for that? You're going to have certain requirements to receive a driver's license. If you're blind, it's not discrimination on the basis of a disability to say you can't receive a driver's license, right? Because that's a requirement that's very relevant to being able to drive. Seatbelt law, brake lights, car inspections. Look, now some of these might be imprudent. I live in a state where every year the government says we have to get our car inspected. And I've never lived in a state like this before. And it just strikes me that it's a racket where, I take the car in and the mechanic gets the mandatory fee that I have to pay. And again, I've never lived in a state that did this, and it seems like vehicle safety functions just fine in those states. So it strikes me that this isn't really a necessary activity for the sake of the common good. But this is, someone in the state house at some point had the idea of how can we get some money to some mechanics? Every car has to be inspected every year, right? But who knows, right? Like maybe it actually is. I haven't looked into it, so maybe there's good evidence that shows that this really does reduce vehicular problems, that by detecting stuff earlier, there are fewer accidents and then there are fewer deaths. Like, I don't know. I haven't looked into that. But those are the things that you would have to be looking for. Most of us think it's legitimate for the state to say you have to wear a seatbelt. And the reason why is that let's say you're like, look, I'm free to do whatever I want, But if you're not wearing a seatbelt when you get in a car accident, you're now placing a drain on the entire society. You're taking up a hospital bed. You're getting an ambulance that has to come and transport you. Right? You're placing a burden on the community as a whole that could have been prevented. Right? And something as, I think, non-invasive as wearing a seatbelt prevents the EMT and others from having to go out if you get in a simple fender bender. Right? So anyway, there isn't going to be like the clarity that I think libertarianism sometimes gives you very simple, pat, conclusive, clear answers, because it only takes one aspect, the liberty aspect, and it holds it up as the most important aspect. And so one of the things that I wanted to kind of stress tonight is that, sound political thinking is going to have to wrestle with complexity, right? It's going to have to wrestle with, on the one hand, we have harms to our physical life, but we're also seeing harms to our mental and spiritual and economic lives caused by the measures that we've taken to combat the physical harms, right? On one hand, we say religious liberty and parental rights are really important, but we have to limit those sometimes when, for example, certain religious parents won't allow their children to receive life-saving medications. We can't just say, but my rights or but my freedoms or but my, because all of them have certain limits. So then like the real interesting discussion is like, what are those limits? Where should they be? And on that, you have to do it issue by issue, right? So, seatbelts, yay or nay, DUIs, yay or nay, yearly auto mechanic inspections, yay or nay. We're going to have to talk about, because our rights and our liberties are an aspect of that common good, but so too are certain regulations. And there's no kind of like a priori answer in any given situation.
Right. What do you think the government needs to do to improve people's trust in it? We're getting quite a few comments on this. We've basically got to trust the government. There's a lot of skepticism around that notion. I mean, we've heard things that masks don't work, masks do work. There seems to be just a distrust in whether or not the government generally has all of these complicated factors going into their decisions.
Yeah, and not just the government. Like, I mean, I think if you look, trust in science and doctors has also declined because it wasn't just, government officials who shaded the truth. We had various medical doctors as well. And then, the explanation of, well, I was afraid that there'd be a run on PPE or something like that. Why not trust the American people, right? And especially when, you're asking them to trust you as the expert, as the official. So, I mean, what can we do to restore that? I mean, like, one is it just means each and every one of us needs to practice the virtue of honesty, right? We shouldn't be lying. We shouldn't be shading the truth. We should be speaking the truth courageously and civilly, charitably, right? We also don't need to like engage in bomb dropping or anything like that. I think there need to be consequences for people who violate the public trust, right? There should be, you shouldn't be able to do this and get away with it. Another thought I had on kind of the, why is public trust so low on science is how often certain scientists will abuse their authority. Like during the stem cell debate, you had all sorts of people trying to more or less deny the science about the early embryo, saying it's not really a human being, it's a clump of cells, right? Like anyone who knows the basics of embryology and developmental biology knows that's not true. You see that right now in some of the gender dysphoria debate, right? You have doctors saying sex is assigned at birth. Your distinguished lecturer next month, Abigail Schreier, her book on particularly rapid onset gender dysphoria for teenage and 20-something girls and young women. It's a wonderful book. And I encourage everyone to go to that lecture. And one of the things she points out is how certain people within the scientific and medical community aren't being straight with us. And that's particularly, imagine how difficult of a situation it is if you're the parent of a child with gender dysphoria, and your doctor's not being straight with you, not being honest, right? So it's a huge problem. And so I think, one, we just have to, recommit to the virtue of honesty. There's a reason why thou shalt not lie is one of those 10 commandments. It's one of the aspects of the natural law. You can't have a flourishing community. You can't have a flourishing political community. You can't have a flourishing medical community if you're lying. So that's one. And then two, I do think there needs to be certain consequences. And I don't know, what those should look like, but, either as like, a healthcare system who internally regulates itself, or as a political community, if you can get away with lying, what's going to prevent you from doing it in the future? Right. So there do needs to be some consequences for that.
I think your notion of agenda-driven science is spot on, and I think that's really concerning a lot of people. I was looking at the other day of what's happened to media. Right now, only 10% of conservatives trust media. So look at the problems this creates when the media is trying to say something. There's a tremendous amount of distrust that exists there. The examples you mentioned on transgenderism, and I mean, we grew up all watching Bill Nye the Science Guy. Now I can't stand the guy because I know every time
he edited one of the videos. So from when you and I were kids, and he was explaining like a male and a female and how male, and they went back and they edited out some of that so that it could be more sex assigned at birth language. Yeah. And actually, Jeff, as you were just speaking, it made me think that this actually really is another way of thinking about the common good, right? Because everything that you and I just said, we didn't talk about rights or liberties. We just talked about how a society can't flourish when there's not trust between government and citizens. They can't flourish when there's not trust between doctors and patients, when there's not trust between the media and viewers. All of that is simply to say that the common good of medicine, the common good of government, the common good of media can't even exist without that type of trust, which means that lies undermine those common goods, right? I think that's a helpful way of thinking about this, precisely because it's how Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, so very prominent people within the natural law tradition thought about this. But two, it's how you think about your own family, right? When you and your wife and your kids are talking about this, you're not primarily talking about your rights and your liberties, right? You're talking about what's going to be good for my family, what's going to make my family flourish. What can I do to help my children? What can my children do to help each other? What can I do to help my spouse? And when you're making decisions, you're not making it based upon your personal self-interest or your personal rights and liberties. You're doing it as what's going to make the family as a whole flourish. And obviously a part of that in the political context will be rights, right? But it won't be the only aspect.
I think you've given us a really helpful understanding this evening that of exploring all the complicated issues around these decisions that we have to make. COVID-19, you can take the vaccination. It's from what I understand, listening to tonight, it's morally okay. It's a moral good to take the vaccination, but more than that, I think what you challenge us to do is look at a lot of the complicated factors, right? So, and to weigh that, for those of us that may have already had COVID, we're younger, delay and allow older people to get that's a morally acceptable decision as well, because there's a lot of mitigating factors, reduced access to it, a likelihood of dying. Those all have to come in. And so you've got to, when you're making decisions like this, you've got to look at the broad, complicated factors and then be serious about and analyzing those when you make a decision. As you mentioned, if this vaccine was still derived from commonly aborted fetal tissue, on an ongoing basis, that would change our discussion, change how we look at this. And so we've got to look through a lot of these factors when we make a decision. I'll give the last word to you, and then we'll wrap it up with a few announcements.
Sure. I mean, I think that's exactly right. Everything you just said strikes me as a nice summation. As we're thinking about, what are we going to do? We should be thinking not just what's in my best interest. Right? What would be my best interest is to run out and get the vaccine ASAP. But, chances are, if you're my age and you were to get COVID, you would fare a lot better than if you're 80 years old and you got COVID, right? And so part of, loving my neighbor is allowing the person who's at greater risk to receive it first. Allowing the person, I sit in my basement and I read books and I give talks and I write papers. I'm not playing a particularly crucial role in this moment in time. So someone else who is my same age, but who's an EMT or who's an emergency room doctor or who's, they are more critical in this moment than I am, and they should receive, right? That's the way that we should be thinking about this. And then we do want to be careful that we don't do anything that would ever suggest that killing is acceptable, right? Whether that be assisted suicide or that be embryo destructive research or that be abortion. And, there's some kind of like delicate moral philosophizing that needs to be done in, thinking through where the lines are and how it applies in different situations. So I hope I gave you that framework, because to my mind, like a year or so from now, this will, thank God, all be behind us. But the framework is something that I think is going to be relevant. It's the way that, hopefully the students can think about a whole host of bioethical questions throughout the rest of their lives. So hopefully the framework will remain with us.
Great. Well, Dr. Anderson, before we go, I'm going to share my screen here real quick. I want folks to learn a little bit about public discourse. This is where I saw the original article that jumped into this. Can you share with us a little bit about public discourse and your work there?
Sure. So a Public Discourse is it's an online journal, the Journal of the Witherspoon Institute. It's something that I started 13 years ago now. 2008, it was when I had just finished. I had been an assistant editor at the journal First Things, and I was starting graduate school at the University of Notre Dame, and I wanted to keep doing some writing and some editing. And so I started creating, I created Public Discourse, and then it's grown and it's grown and it's grown. And now 13 years later, it's published a lot of, to my mind, really important essays. The vision statement here is that it is a kind of biblically orthodox, natural law inspired publication, where on essentials we toe a pretty strict editorial line. So you're only going to see stuff that's pro-life, pro-marriage, pro-bodily integrity, pro-religious liberty. And then on things that are prudential questions, we host debates, right? Whether or not you should vote for President Trump. We had pro and cons on that. Questions about whether or not you can lie for the sake of exposing Planned Parenthood. We had pros and cons on that debate. So we try to give people knowledge to inform their thinking on critical issues. The essays are written by academics, but they're written for non-academics, right? So the genre here is it's like a double op-ed. It's the size of like 2 newspaper op-eds put together, but it's meant so that anyone with a high school or college degree could read it and understand it. It's not PhDs writing for other PhDs. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning that. I appreciate it.
Well, what I've really appreciated about your work, especially when it comes to the traditional definition of marriage, I think what you call the conjugal definition of marriage, I've really appreciated you guys providing the intellectual firepower for a lot of us that debate the stuff in the public square. I kind of bridge both worlds. I'm an academic because I work at a university and I have a few master's degrees, but I'm just a regular guy. So I appreciate what you guys do here. They've got an ability to subscribe up here, as well as support the work of Public Discourse. And Ryan, you're also at the Heritage Foundation, one of our great friends, one of the best sponsors we've had of the Western Conservative Summit. So thank you for all the work that you do at the Heritage Foundation. We're grateful for that. As we close up here next month, we are, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the screen share. We are going to be hosting Abigail Schreier on her book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. This book was very controversial, not for being wrong, but for being right. And Target took it off its shelves because of protest, put it back on its shelves because it's a correct book. Abigail is a writer with the Wall Street Journal. That is February 15th. So mark your calendars on that. We're also back to our legislative work down at the Capitol. The legislature started this week. I want to invite you to become a part of Centennial Frontline, where we analyze the legislation that's going on down there. And we have our calls on Fridays at 2 p.m. to go through what the legislature did to ruin our state down at the Capitol. So with that, I want to thank everybody for being a part of this distinguished lecture series. You can always find out more information